Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I moved into my house about a year ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, older home on the outskirts of town. A place that felt safe, away from the constant noise of city life. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I figured it was just because it had been sitting empty for a while. The landlord didn't say much when I signed the lease, just handed over the keys with an expression I couldn't quite read. Maybe I should have asked more questions, but at the time, I was just happy to have a place of my own. The house itself was nothing special. One story, with faded blue paint and an overgrown lawn that I kept telling myself it'd take care of, but never did. It had 2 bedrooms, though I only needed one, and a narrow hallway that always felt just a little too dark, no matter how many lights I turned on. The floors creaked, the pipes groaned, but I chalked it all up to age. Old houses made noise. It was just part of the charm. I had a simple routine. I worked at a hardware store, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. He'd get home around 6, heat up whatever frozen meal I had in the fridge, and settle on the couch for a few hours of mindless TV before bed. Sometimes I'd read, sometimes I'd scroll through my phone until my eyes burned, but that was about it. Quiet, uneventful, predictable. The first few months passed without incident. I got used to the quirks of the house. The way the floor dipped slightly in the hallway, the way the windows rattled when the wind picked up at night. The nights were eerily silent, but I liked that. No honking cars, no distant sirens, just the occasional owl outside my window or the rustle of trees against the roof. I slept well in those early days, never once waking up to strange noises or eerie sensations. The house, despite its age, felt like mine. It'd fill my weekends with small home projects, repainting the kitchen cabinets, replacing the broken doorknob in the bathroom, patching up cracks in the walls. Little things, nothing too serious. Everything felt normal. Until it didn't. The change was subtle at first, so small that I almost didn't notice. It started with a feeling, a strange, almost imperceptible shift in the air. It'd be sitting in my living room, half watching some show I wasn't even interested in, and suddenly feel off, like I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me from just beyond my field of vision. It'd turn my head quickly, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing there. Just my empty kitchen, my dimly lit hallway, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. It happened a few times, enough for me to notice, but not enough for me to question my sanity. Everyone gets that feeling sometimes, right? That weird, creeping sensation that you're being watched, only to find nothing out of place. I brushed it off. But then, the sounds started. At first, it was just small things. A faint scratching noise coming from inside the walls. Not constant, just a brief, almost hesitant sound, like something shifting behind the drywall. I told myself it was probably mice. Old houses had pests. It wasn't anything to be concerned about. I even went to the store and picked up a few traps, setting them around the baseboards just in case. Then, one night, I heard something that made my skin crawl. I had just turned off the TV and was heading to my bedroom when I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. A voice. A low, murmuring voice, just on the other side of the wall. I froze. It was so soft that I couldn't make out the words, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stood there, heart pounding, straining to hear more. But just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The house was silent again, nothing but the sound of my own breathing filling the space around me. I tried to tell myself it was just the pipes. Old houses made weird noises, and sometimes the mind played tricks when the world got too quiet. I even laughed at myself, shaking my head as I climbed into bed. But that night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. Something wasn't right, and I was about to find out just how wrong I was. I didn't tell anyone about what I heard that night. Maybe I should have, but what would I even say? That I heard a voice in my wall? That I stood there, frozen, listening to something that shouldn't have been there? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head, so I buried it. I convinced myself it was a trick of the mind, just the wind outside, the pipe settling, my brain misinterpreting an ordinary sound. But something about it lingered. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. Every time a customer asked me something, I had to ask them to repeat it. My manager even pulled me aside and asked if I was feeling all right. I lied, said I hadn't been sleeping well, which wasn't entirely untrue. Even though I got into bed at my usual time, I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the noise over and over. I told myself that was the end of it, that I'd get home that evening, go through my routine like always, and everything would go back to normal. But I was wrong. That night, as I sat on the couch watching TV, I felt it again. That strange, heavy feeling of being watched. It was worse than before, more oppressive. The kind of feeling that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I turned off the TV. The room fell into silence, and for a moment, I just sat there, listening. Nothing. Just the distant sound of cars passing outside, the hum of the refrigerator. Everything seemed normal. And then, the scratching came back. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, like something testing the boundaries of the wall. I sat completely still, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the same spot, just to the right of the television, near the hallway entrance. I swallowed hard. Mice, I told myself. It had to be mice. Maybe even a squirrel that had gotten stuck inside. It was an old house. This kind of thing happened all the time. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something felt off. The sound wasn't erratic, like you'd expect from a rodent scrambling inside the walls. It was slow, deliberate, like something was feeling its way along the inside of the drywall. I stood up, my legs a little unsteady. All right, I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself I wasn't scared. Let's see what we're dealing with. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked toward the wall. As soon as I got close, the scratching stopped. I pressed my hand against the drywall, feeling for vibrations. Nothing. The air around me felt still, too still, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stayed there for a moment, my pulse hammering against my ribs. And then, just as I started to turn away, a single, soft tap against the inside of the wall. I jumped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My heart was pounding, my skin cold with adrenaline. That wasn't a mouse. That wasn't a squirrel. That was something else. I stood there, my chest rising and falling in short, shallow breaths, waiting. But there was nothing, just silence. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the wall like I expected something to burst through at any second. I turned all the lights on, every single one in the house, and sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. I waited for it to happen again, but it didn't. The house remained quiet for the rest of the night, almost as if whatever had been inside the wall was waiting for me to let my guard down. Eventually, exhaustion won. I fell asleep on the couch, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, it was easier to explain it away. Maybe I was half asleep when I heard the tap. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe the scratching was a tree branch outside, brushing against the siding. I had 100 different explanations, and I let myself believe them. But that night, the scratching came back. And it wasn't just in one spot anymore. It was in the walls all around me. I sat up straight in bed, every muscle in my body tense. The sound moved, almost like it was crawling, starting from the corner of my room and slowly shifting toward my bed. I turned on the lamp. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, staring at the wall, my skin crawling with something I couldn't name. I waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. I turned off the lamp and lay back down. And just as my eyelids started to droop, tap! Right above my head. I bolted upright, my chest tight with fear. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't normal. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called the landlord. "I think I have mice," I told him, trying to keep my voice even. "Or something bigger. I hear scratching in the walls at night." He was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "I'll send someone over." An exterminator showed up later that afternoon. A short, older guy with tired eyes who seemed more interested in finishing his job quickly than actually solving the problem. He walked through the house, knocked on a few walls, set a couple of traps, and shrugged. "Didn't see any droppings," he said. "Could be a rat. Maybe a bird stuck in the vent. Let me know if you catch anything." That was it. No real answers. No reassurance. That night, I lay in bed, listening. The scratching started earlier this time. I stared at the ceiling, my heart thudding in my chest. Then came the tapping. Not just one. Several. Like someone drumming their fingers against the inside of the wall. I squeezed my eyes shut. "It's just an animal," I told myself. Just an animal. But deep down, I knew animals didn't tap. And they didn't whisper. Because that night, as I lay frozen in bed, I heard it again, low, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice. Muffled. Distant. Coming from inside the walls. I didn't go to work the next day. I told my manager I was sick, which, in a way, wasn't a lie. I felt like I was coming apart. My body ached from exhaustion. My mind was sluggish from lack of sleep. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling that I was no longer alone in my own house. Because I wasn't. That night had changed everything. Hearing my name, come from inside the walls had shattered any rational explanation I had left. There was no denying it anymore. No explaining it away as mice or the winds or faulty plumbing. Something was in there, and it knew me, but I still had no proof. I spent most of the day sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the walls, listening. It was silent now. Nothing but the occasional creak of the house settling and the distant hum of traffic outside. It was almost like the house was mocking me, staying quiet when I was desperate for evidence. I needed to know what was going on. And that meant I had to start looking for answers. By late afternoon, I had a plan. I went out and bought a small motion-activated camera, the kind people use for home security. It wasn't fancy, but it would do the job. If something was moving inside the walls, I wanted to catch it. I set it up in my bedroom, aimed directly at the spot where it heard the voice the night before. Then I waited. The hours dragged by. I tried to act normal, cook myself some dinner, watch TV, but I was constantly on edge. Every sound made me tense up. Every shift in the shadows made my pulse race. And when night fell, the house came alive. The moment I turned off the lights, the scratching started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just in the walls, it was everywhere. The sound moved fast, scuttling from one end of the room to the other, like dozens of small hands clawing their way through the inside of my home. I gripped the edge of my blanket, my breathing shallow. Then, the tapping started. Not soft this time. Not hesitant. Loud. Aggressive. Bang. 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 It came from inside the closet. I shot up in bed, my chest heaving. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. My mind screamed at me to turn on the lights, to get out, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, the whispering returned. It was clearer this time, right outside my ear. I felt my entire body go cold. The voice wasn't muffled anymore. It was right next to me. A slow, deliberate exhale. I threw myself out of bed, crashing onto the floor in a tangle of sheets and blind panic. My hands scrambled for the lamp, knocking over a glass of water in the process. I flicked it on. Silence! The pounding stopped. The whispering was gone, but I wasn't alone. I sat frozen on the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then I heard them. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, moving down the hallway, inside the walls. I shot up, my body trembling, and yanked open the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the sound didn't stop. It moved past me, toward the living room. I followed it. Every step I took, the sound moved further ahead, almost like it was leading me somewhere. And then, as I reached the center of the living room, it stopped. Right in front of the wall, near the TV. The same wall where it first heard the scratching. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. And then, before I could think, before I could talk myself out of it, I raised my hand and knocked 3 times. The moment my knuckles hit the drywall, the entire house shook. A deep, groaning sound filled the air, like the house itself was breathing. The walls shuddered, the furniture rattled, the lights flickered. I stumbled backward, barely managing to keep my balance. And then, from inside the wall, something knocked back. 3 times. Exactly like I had. I turned and ran. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door, not caring that I was in nothing but sweatpants and a t-shirt. I needed to get out, to breathe, to be anywhere but inside that house. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, hands gripping the wheel, staring at the dark windows of my house, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to go back inside. I checked every room, every corner, every closet. Nothing was out of place. But the air still felt wrong, thick with something unseen. I barely slept. And when the sun came up, I checked the camera. Something had been in my room. I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop open, my heart hammering as I scrolled through the footage. Most of it was just me, lying in bed, tossing and turning. Hours of nothing. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the camera detected movement. I clicked on the clip, my stomach twisting. At first, I didn't see anything. Just my dark room, illuminated by the dim glow of my alarm clock. I lay still in bed, facing the wall. Then, the closet door creaked open. I stopped breathing. The door opened slowly, inch by inch, until the darkness inside yawned wide. And then, something moved. Not a rat, not a squirrel. Something tall. Something human-shaped. I slammed the laptop shut. No, 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 no. I forced myself to open it again, to rewind the footage, but my hands were shaking so hard I could barely control the mouse. I played it back. The closet door. The figure. The movement. But this time, I noticed something else. As the figure stepped forward, something caught the light. A hand. It pressed against the wall, just above my head. And then, it turned. Slowly. Deliberately. Until its face was looking directly at the camera. I couldn't make out the details. The footage was grainy, the figure barely illuminated. But I saw the shape of a mouth. And then, it smiled. I shoved the laptop away and backed up, my heart hammering in my chest. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the footage didn't lie. And worse, it had been watching me. My body felt frozen in place as I stared at the laptop screen, my mind refusing to process what I had just seen. That thing, whatever it was, had been inside my room, inside my closet, standing over me while I slept, and it had smiled at the camera. I shoved the laptop shut so hard it nearly tipped over. My hands were shaking, my skin damp with sweat. Every inch of my body screamed at me to leave, to grab my keys, run to my car, and never come back. But I didn't move. I had to know more. I had to see it again. I forced myself to open the laptop, my fingers trembling over the trackpad. I replayed the footage, watching the moment frame by frame. The closet door, the shadow, the movement, the way its hand slid over the wall above my head. Then, the face. That awful, stretched out grin. But as I examined it closer, a sick realization set in. It wasn't just smiling. It was mimicking me. The way I curled up in my sleep. The way my mouth twitched in a restless dream. It was watching me so closely that it had begun to copy me. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the house. I jumped so violently that the laptop nearly flew off the table. The sound had come from behind me, from the bedroom. My entire body went cold. The walls weren't just hiding something. They were alive. I stood up so fast my chair tipped over. Every nerve in my body was screaming for me to run, but my feet carried me forward toward the hallway. The door to my bedroom was open, and I could hear it again. That soft, deliberate sound. Tap, 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 like fingers trailing along the inside of the walls. I gritted my teeth, trying to stop the rising panic clawing in my throat. I had to see it. I had to know what was in there. I stepped inside. The room was still, silent, but the air was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I turned toward the closet. The door was wide open. I hadn't left it open. I forced myself to move closer. The darkness inside stretched deep, deeper than it should have, like the space went further than the dimensions of my house allowed. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the inside wall. It felt wrong. Too soft, too warm, like skin. Then, something moved inside. I yanked my hand back as a deep, guttural breath echoed from the closet. I staggered backward, my heart hammering. And then, I saw it. Not in the closet. Not in the shadows. But inside the wall itself. The drywall rippled like the surface of a pond. Then, a shape began to emerge. A hand, stretching outward, the fingers long and unnaturally thin. Then, a second hand. They pressed against the wall as if trying to force their way through. And then, the face. It pushed forward from inside the wall, stretching the surface like plastic wrap. Its features were distorted, unnatural. The mouth stretched too wide. The eyes were hollow, deep voids that seemed to pull at me, drawing me in. It was smiling. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with terror. Then it spoke, in my voice. A perfect copy, but wrong. Too slow, too distorted. Let me in. I let out a choked gasp, my mind scrambling for logic, for reason, for anything that could explain what I was seeing. But there was nothing. Nothing human about this. The thing inside my walls wasn't just watching me. It was trying to become me. I bolted. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted down the hallway. But as I reached the living room, something slammed into the walls with a sickening thud. Then another. And another. The walls bulged, as if something was trying to push through from the inside. The entire house groaned, the floor vibrating beneath my feet. I grabbed my phone, my fingers barely able to work the screen through my shaking hands. I didn't even know who I was calling. 911. A friend. Anyone. But before I could dial, The voice returned. It came from all around me. You let me watch. Now let me in. The lights flickered. The walls moved. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from one spot. It was everywhere. Above me, behind me, beneath my feet, inside me. I stumbled toward the front door, my hands fumbling with the lock. I could feel it, something pressing against the walls, straining against the surface. It was going to break through. I twisted the handle and yanked the door open. And then, just as I stepped outside, silence! The air outside was sharp and cold against my damp skin. I gulped it in like I had been drowning. I turned back, expecting to see something. The walls shifting, a figure in the window, anything. But the house was still. Normal. Like nothing had happened. I stood there, panting, my heart threatening to explode out of my chest. Then, from the open doorway, a whisper. My name. I slammed the door shut. I ran to my car and sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. I had never felt so wrong, so violated in my entire life. Something had been inside my house. Or worse, it had always been there. And now it wanted more. It wanted me. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My entire body was drenched in sweat, but I was shivering. My pulse throbbed in my ears, every breath coming out shaky and uneven. I kept staring at the house, expecting, no, dreading, to see something move behind the windows. A shadow, a hand, that face. But nothing happened. The house just sat there, quiet, still, like it hadn't just tried to swallow me whole. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, making me flinch so hard I nearly hit my head on the roof. I grabbed it with shaking fingers. A notification from my security camera app. Motion detected. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to open the app, heart hammering against my ribs. The live feed from the living room loaded in slow, agonizing seconds. And when it finally appeared, the house was empty. No movement. No figures. But I didn't feel relief. Because I knew, deep in my gut, that the cameras wouldn't catch it. That thing wasn't just hiding. It was inside the house. Inside the walls. Watching. Waiting. For me. I couldn't stay. That much was clear. Whatever was in there, whatever had been following me, copying me, it wasn't going to stop. Not unless I left. I started the car with trembling hands and backed out of the driveway. My house, my home, grew smaller in the rearview mirror. And for the first time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The attic window. I had never paid much attention to it before. I never even used the attic. But now, as I drove away, I saw it. A shape. Standing there. Motionless. Watching me leave. I didn't look back again. I drove straight to a motel on the other side of town, checking in without even turning off my car. The girl at the front desk gave me a strange look, probably because I looked like I had just survived a near-death experience. She asked if I was okay. I told her no. The motel room was small and smelled like stale air, but I didn't care. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and collapsed onto the bed. I should have been exhausted. My body was screaming for sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. What was that thing? How long had it been there? Had it always been watching me? And the worst question of all, had it followed me? I forced myself to check my phone again. No notifications. No motion detected. For the first time in hours, I let out a breath of relief. Maybe I was safe. Maybe it was over. But then, the knocking started. I shot upright, my skin going ice cold. The sound was faint, but I knew it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall behind the motel bed. My stomach twisted into knots. My breath came in shallow gasps. I reached for my phone with shaking fingers, turning on the flashlight. Slowly, I climbed out of bed, pressing my ear to the wall. Silence! Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just paranoid. Then, right next to my ear, a voice. Let me in. I screamed. I grabbed my things and ran. I didn't check out. I didn't explain anything. I just got in my car and drove. Drove until I was far, far away. I never went back to that house, not even to collect my things. I paid a service to clear out my belongings, but I told them not to go inside after dark. I didn't explain why. I didn't have to. I found a new apartment in a different town, in a building with concrete walls. No attics. No crawl spaces. No hiding places. But even now, even after all this time, sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I hear it. Faint, almost imperceptible. Tap, tap, tap. Somewhere deep inside the walls. And I know the house wasn't just haunted. It was hungry. And it will never stop looking for me. It's been months now, maybe a year. I stopped keeping track. Some nights, it feels like I just left that house yesterday. Other nights, it feels like a lifetime ago. But the fear never left. I moved across the state, changed jobs, changed my phone number. I deleted every photo I had of that house, erased every trace of it from my life. I never even checked the real estate listings to see if someone else moved in. I don't want to know, because deep down, I do know. That house wasn't empty when I lived there, and it's not empty now. Even in my new apartment, I can't shake the feeling that something is always watching. I catch myself avoiding the corners of rooms, as if something is standing just outside my line of sight. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart hammering, convinced I heard it again. That soft, deliberate sound. Tap, tap, tap. But I tell myself it's just my imagination. Because the alternative is that it found me. And I can't let myself believe that. I've replayed that night over and over in my head. I've asked myself the same questions 100 times. Did I do something wrong? Was there a moment, one moment, where I could have stopped it? Could I have just ignored the sounds? Never investigated? Would it have left me alone? Or was I always doomed the moment I moved in? I don't have answers. But I have a warning. If you ever hear something inside your walls, something that shouldn't be there, don't investigate. Don't go looking. Because some things aren't meant to be found. And once you find them, they never let you go. It started when I moved into my new apartment. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and the idea of having my own space felt like the fresh start I needed. The place was perfect, or at least as perfect as a one-bedroom rental in an old, slightly run-down building could be. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood was quiet, and my landlord didn't ask too many questions. That last part should have been my first red flag. I remember the day I moved in like it was yesterday. It was one of those crisp fall afternoons where the air smelled like dried leaves and distant bonfires. The apartment itself was nothing fancy. A small living room with outdated carpeting, a tiny kitchen with old wooden cabinets, and a bedroom just big enough for my bed and a dresser. The walls were thin. I could hear my neighbor's TV at night. but I figured that was just part of the charm. I spent the first few days unpacking, arranging my furniture, and getting used to the place. My routine was simple: work during the day, come home, cook something quick, and unwind in front of the TV. I had always been a night owl, and this apartment was the perfect little hideaway. The first thing I noticed that seemed off wasn't anything supernatural, it was the layout. Something about the space felt wrong. I had walked through the entire place before signing the lease, but now that I was living in it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The walls seemed thicker than they should be, and the dimensions of the apartment just felt slightly off. But I brushed it off. I wasn't an architect. Maybe it was just the way the building was designed. My first few weeks were uneventful. The strangest thing I had to deal with was a flickering light in the hallway and the occasional sound of pipes groaning late at night. Old buildings made noises, and faulty wiring wasn't exactly rare. Nothing worth losing sleep over. One night, after a particularly long shift at work, I came home exhausted. I tossed my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto my couch. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was well past midnight. My apartment was dead silent. I remember feeling disoriented, like something had woken me up, but I wasn't sure what. I sat there for a moment, rubbing my eyes, when I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow. And then I heard a faint sound, so quiet I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. It wasn't coming from my apartment. It was coming from inside the walls. A soft scratching. Slow. Deliberate. I sat there, frozen. It didn't sound like mice. It was too controlled, too purposeful. But the sound faded just as quickly as it had started, leaving me alone in the silence of my dimly lit living room. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the building settling or a neighbor moving around in the next unit. It wasn't worth getting worked up over. I turned off the TV, locked the door, and went to bed. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because the next night, I heard it again. The next night, I tried to convince myself that everything was normal. I had slept fine after that strange scratching sound, and there was no reason to think anything was wrong. But that didn't stop my brain from fixating on it. At work, I found myself replaying the sound in my head over and over again. It hadn't been random, that much I was sure of. It was too deliberate, like someone dragging their nails along the inside of the wall in slow, careful strokes. But that didn't make any sense. The apartment walls weren't hollow, and as far as I knew, there weren't any vents or crawl spaces large enough for something or someone to be inside. By the time I got home, I had convinced myself it had to be a rodent. Maybe the building had rats, and one had gotten stuck between the walls. That was a logical explanation. It wasn't exactly comforting, but at least it wasn't anything supernatural. I ate dinner, watched some TV, and tried to go about my night as usual. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional noise from my neighbor's unit. Around midnight, I turned everything off and headed to my bedroom. I stood in the doorway for a second, staring at the darkened space beyond. My bed sat against the far wall, the only source of light coming from the dim glow of a street lamp outside my window. I don't know why, but I hesitated before stepping inside. Something felt different. The air was still, almost too still. There was an odd sort of pressure, like the weight of the room had shifted in some unexplainable way. I shook off the feeling and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chest. And then I heard it. The same scratching sound. But this time, it was louder. And it wasn't coming from the living room wall. It was coming from behind my bedroom closet. I sat up instantly, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound wasn't constant. It came in short, uneven bursts. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. It was almost hesitant, like whatever was making it was testing something. I stared at the closet door, barely breathing. The closet was built into the wall, just a simple wooden door with a metal handle. There was no way anyone could be inside, especially not without me noticing. It wasn't big enough for a hidden space behind it, and the other side of the wall led to my neighbor's apartment. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the closet door. The second the light hit the wood, the scratching stopped. Just silence. I swallowed hard. I told myself it had to be a mouse, maybe even a branch scraping against the outside of the building. I didn't live on the ground floor, but there were trees nearby, and the wind had been strong earlier. Yeah, that had to be it. I forced myself to lie back down, my muscles tense. For what felt like hours, I stared at the closet, waiting for the noise to start again. But it never did. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I had work to do, errands to run. There was no point in freaking myself out over nothing. But then, as I was getting dressed, I noticed something. The closet door was open. Not by much, just an inch or two. But I knew for a fact that I had shut it the night before. I always did. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the small gap. I hadn't heard it open. I hadn't felt anything. But somehow, between the time I had fallen asleep and the moment I woke up, that door had moved. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I forced myself to walk over and pull the door all the way open. The closet was exactly how I had left it, shirts hanging neatly on their hangers, a few boxes stacked on the top shelf. There was nothing out of place. No signs of rodents or loose boards. No hidden doors or panels. But the air inside the closet smelled different. Not bad, not rotten, just off. It was faint, but there was something stale about it, like an old, dusty room that hadn't been opened in years. I stepped back and shut the door, making sure it latched this time. Then I left for work, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. That night, I decided to test something. I set my phone up on a shelf, camera pointing at the closet. I didn't have a fancy security system, but I figured a simple time-lapse recording might help me figure out if I had just left the door open by accident or if something else was happening. I went to bed, forcing myself to relax. The apartment was quiet, no strange noises, no scratching. Maybe I had just freaked myself out over nothing. But when I woke up the next morning and checked my phone, my stomach dropped. The closet door had opened again. And this time, I had proof. The video showed me sleeping, the room still and undisturbed for hours. Then, just after 3 a.m., the closet door creaked open, slowly, inch by inch, until it stopped at the exact same angle as before. But that wasn't the worst part. A few minutes later, something moved. Not inside the closet. In the reflection of the mirror on the opposite wall. A shape just barely visible in the grainy, dim light. Tall, thin, standing just behind the open door. And then, as if it knew I was watching, it stepped back into the darkness. I dropped my phone. My whole body was ice cold. I had to be seeing things. It was probably just a trick of the light, a glitch in the recording. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because when I turned to look at the closet again, the door was open, just like in the video. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of my bed, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers hurt. My eyes stayed locked on the closet door, which now stood slightly ajar, just enough to remind me that something wasn't right. I had left it closed. I knew I had. The recording was still on my screen, paused at the exact moment the door had opened. But it wasn't the door moving on its own that made my stomach twist into knots. It was what I had seen in the mirror. That shape, that thing, tall, thin, and standing inside the closet. I forced myself to get up. My legs felt stiff, unsteady. Every step toward that door felt like I was walking straight into something I wasn't meant to see. But I couldn't just sit there. I had to look. I reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and grabbed the handle. A deep breath. Then I yanked it open. The closet was empty. Of course it was. Clothes on hangers, boxes on the top shelf, shoes neatly lined up on the floor. Everything exactly how I had left it. I let out a shaky exhale. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe I had been so freaked out by the scratching sounds that my brain had made up the shadow in the mirror. It had to be some kind of trick of the light. But then I noticed something. The air inside the closet was wrong again. That same stale, dusty smell. But now it was stronger, almost thick, like the air itself carried weight. And beneath it, something else. Something faint but unmistakable. A metallic scent. The kind you smell when you get a paper cut. I backed away, chest tight. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I knew one thing. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was in my apartment, and it knew I had seen it. The next few days, things got worse. At first, it was subtle. Small, almost insignificant changes that I could have ignored if I hadn't been looking for them. The closet door kept opening on its own, every single night. No matter how many times I shut it, no matter how many heavy objects I placed against it, I would wake up to find it slightly ajar. Then, my things started moving. Keys weren't where I had left them. My phone charger disappeared, only to reappear inside the closet. One morning, I found my wallet inside the fridge. But the worst was the mirror. I had tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was nothing. But every night, when I lay in bed, I felt it watching me. I would catch glimpses out of the corner of my eye, quick flashes of movement in the reflection. My own image would seem off somehow, like it was slightly out of sync. And sometimes, just for a second, I could swear I saw something standing behind me. Then, the knocking started. It came at exactly 3:33 a.m. every night. Not from the door. Not from the window. From inside the closet. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Like someone was waiting. I never opened it. Not anymore. The first time it happened, I sat up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. My heart pounded in my chest, breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. I stared at the closet door, waiting, barely daring to blink. Then, 3 more knocks. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in place, listening to my own pulse roaring in my ears. But eventually, the knocking stopped. The next morning, I found something written on my mirror. Not written exactly, etched, scratched into the glass in jagged, uneven lines. Let me out. I had to know. I couldn't keep pretending this was all in my head. I needed answers. So that night, before bed, I set up my phone to record again. But this time, I didn't just point it at the closet. I sat in front of it, staring at the screen, waiting. The room was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My fingers drummed against my knee, restless, anxious. And then, the knocking. I nearly dropped the phone. 3 slow, heavy knocks from inside the closet. I clenched my jaw, swallowing hard. My whole body was screaming at me to run, but I stayed. Then, my breath caught in my throat. Because in the dim glow of the phone screen, I saw the closet door move. Not much. Just an inch or two. But enough. Enough to let something through. A sharp, rasping breath filled the air. I bolted. I didn't stop until I was in the hallway, door locked behind me, hands shaking so hard I could barely type out a message to my friend. I told him everything. The noises, the closet, the shape in the mirror. I needed someone else to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. He responded almost immediately. Get out of that apartment. Now. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because when I checked my phone the next morning, the video was still recording. And in the last few seconds of footage, just before I ran, I saw it. The closet door had opened all the way. And someone had stepped out. Tall, thin, face hidden in shadow, watching me. I spent the next day researching the building's history. I needed to know if anything had happened here, if someone had lived in this unit before me, and if they had experienced anything similar. What I found made my stomach turn. Years ago, a man had lived here. A quiet, reclusive tenant. No family, no friends. He had been reported missing, but no body was ever found. The only strange detail in the police report? When the landlord finally cleared out his belongings, they found something disturbing. A sealed-off door in the closet. A hidden space behind the wall. No one ever figured out why it was there, or what was inside. And that's when it hit me. The scratching, the knocking, the shape in the mirror. He had never left. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. After reading about the missing tenant and the hidden space in my closet, the walls around me felt smaller, like they were pressing in. Every shadow stretched too far. Every creak in the floor sounded like a step I hadn't taken. I packed a bag. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely zip it shut. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. I just knew I needed to be anywhere but here. But the apartment had other plans. As I reached for my keys on the counter, I heard it. Creak. The sound of a door slowly opening. I turned, stomach twisting into knots. The closet door was wide open. I had shut it. And shoved a chair against it, and now it was open. My breath came in shallow gasps. My legs refused to move. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't look, but my eyes were already locked on the darkness beyond the doorway. And then something moved. A figure, tall, unnaturally thin, just like I had seen in the mirror. It stood in the threshold, head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me. But the worst part wasn't the shape itself. It was the eyes. They weren't there. Just two hollow sockets, empty and black, like pits that stretched too far into the skull. And then it stepped forward. I ran. I didn't think. I just sprinted toward the front door, fumbling with the lock. My fingers were slick with sweat, slipping against the metal. Behind me, the sound of bare feet dragging across the floor. I wrenched the door open. Slam. It shut. The force sent me stumbling backward, nearly falling to the floor. My chest heaved, heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the handle, twisted, yanked, nothing. It wouldn't budge. I was locked in. The apartment was freezing. My breath came out in sharp, panicked gasps. My vision blurred as the thing moved closer. One slow, shuffling step at a time. I did the only thing I could. I ran into the bedroom and slammed the door shut behind me. I pressed my back against the door, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. My mind raced. This isn't happening. This isn't real. But the scratching. That horrible, relentless scratching. It came from the closet. No, from inside the walls. Fingernails scraping against wood, against plaster, against something deeper. Something trapped. And then, bang! The bedroom door shook. I choked on a breath. Another bang. The door frame rattled. It was trying to get in. I scrambled backward, phone shaking in my grip. My eyes darted around the room. There had to be a way out. The window. I lunged toward it, gripping the frame, trying to push it open. But it was stuck, painted shut. My pulse roared in my ears. I turned back just in time to see the door slowly creak open. The thing stood there, still, silent, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. And then, it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was low, guttural, like something scraping against the inside of a rotting throat. But it said my name. It knew my name. My stomach twisted into knots. My legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in that moment, locked in its gaze. Then, the thing lurched forward. I screamed. Finally, my body listened. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand and hurled it with every ounce of strength I had. The bulb shattered on impact, sparks flying. The thing jerked back, making a horrible, choking sound like it was laughing. But that split-second distraction was all I needed. I turned, throwing myself at the closet. I grabbed at the wall, clawing at the plaster. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I had to get away. My fingers caught the edge of something soft, peeling. Wallpaper. With one hard yank, I tore it away. And beneath it, a door. A second closet door, sealed over with layers of paint and paper. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle. It was rusted, stiff. I twisted, pulled. Behind me, I heard the thing move. Faster this time. I pulled harder. The door gave way. A rush of cold, stagnant air hit me as I stumbled into the darkness. And then I was falling into nothing. I hit the floor hard, my shoulders slamming against something solid. Dust exploded around me. My lungs seized as I coughed, blinking against the darkness. The air was thick, rotten, suffocating. I wasn't in a closet. I was in a room, a hidden chamber built into the apartment walls. And I wasn't alone. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, the faint glow of the screen barely illuminating the space. That's when I saw them, the marks on the walls. Scratch marks. Fingernail grooves, deep and erratic, covering every inch of the enclosed space. And in the center of the room, a mattress. A rotting, stained mattress. With restraints. The realization hit me like a truck. Someone had been kept here. Locked away. Forgotten. And then, in the corner, phones! A skeletal figure slumped against the wall, its jaw hanging open in a permanent scream. Something crunched behind me. I turned. The thing was there. Inside the hidden room. With me. I bolted. I scrambled up, ignoring the way my fingers sank into the decaying mattress. My foot slipped on something I didn't want to think about. The thing lunged. I threw myself toward the exit, clawing at the edges of the hidden door. The light from my bedroom spilled in, almost blinding after the darkness. A hand, cold, bony, too long, grabbed my ankle. I kicked. A choked scream tore from my throat as I wrenched myself free. I scrambled through the opening, gasping as I tore the closet door shut behind me. And then, the apartment went silent. No more knocking. No more scratching. Just the faint, suffocating smell of dust and decay. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, my phone, my keys, anything I could carry. And I ran. I never looked back. I didn't stop running until I was outside. The night air hit me like a shock to the system. Cold, crisp, real. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I forced myself forward, putting as much distance between me and that apartment as possible. I didn't have a plan. My mind was racing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I gripped my phone with shaking fingers, scrolling through my contacts, trying to find someone, anyone, I could call. But who would believe me? Who would believe that I had just escaped something that wasn't human? I stopped at a bus stop 2 blocks away. my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. My hands were still trembling. My clothes were damp with sweat. I glanced back, half expecting to see that thing standing at the end of the street, watching me. But the street was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of traffic in the distance. For the first time since stepping into that apartment, I felt like I could breathe again. I pressed the call button. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Hello? A familiar voice, one of my friends. Relief flooded through me so fast I almost collapsed right there on the pavement. Dude, I gasped. I need to stay at your place tonight. Please. He hesitated. Are you okay? What happened? I couldn't explain it. Not over the phone. Not here, where the air still felt wrong and the shadows stretched too far. I'll explain later, I said, voice raw. I can't stay at my place. There was another pause. Then, yeah, of course, just come over. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thanks. I'll be there soon. I hung up. I still had to go back. Even though every instinct in my body screamed not to, I had to return, to grab my car, to get out of there for good. I forced myself up, legs weak beneath me, and started walking back toward the building. The apartment looked normal. From the outside, it was just another building in the city, its windows dark, its brick walls untouched. If someone had walked by, they never would have guessed that something horrible was inside. But I knew. My car was parked out front. I kept my eyes trained on it, refusing to look up at my apartment window, refusing to acknowledge the sick feeling in my gut. I reached the door handle. My hand was still shaking. As I pulled the door open, I made one mistake. I glanced up, and in the window of my apartment, something was there. It was just a shape, barely visible in the darkness, but it was there, watching. I froze. My body locked up, my stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. I could feel it staring at me, a pressure, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on my chest. And then, it moved. Not a step, not a shift, just the slightest tilt of its head. Like it knew, like it was mocking me. I felt the blood drain from my face. My throat tightened. I ripped my gaze away, yanked the car door open, and threw myself inside. The engine roared to life. I sped off, gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. I refused. The entire drive to my friend's place was a blur. My hands felt numb. My heart still hadn't slowed down. The headlights of passing cars made my vision blur, my brain struggling to make sense of what had happened. By the time I pulled into my friend's driveway, I felt like I had aged 10 years. I sat there for a moment, staring out at the quiet street, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that I had escaped, but the feeling wouldn't leave. The weight of something unseen. The knowledge that something was still there, waiting, watching. I swallowed hard, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. My friend took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "Dude," he said, frowning, "you look like you've seen a ghost." I let out a shaky breath. Not a ghost. His brow furrowed. Then what? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Because how could I explain what had just happened? How could I tell him about the scratching in the walls, the thing that moved in my apartment, the hidden room filled with scratch marks and bones? How could I tell him about the eyes that weren't there? I couldn't. So I just shook my head. I don't know. That was the truth. I didn't know. And I didn't want to. I didn't sleep that night. Even in my friend's apartment, in a different part of the city, I felt uneasy. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scratching, felt the weight of its gaze. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a message from my landlord, some explanation, some confirmation that what I had seen was real. but nothing came. It was like the apartment had swallowed the truth whole, like it didn't want me to tell anyone. The next morning, I checked the apartment listings. Mine was already back on the market. No mention of the hidden room. No mention of the missing tenant. Just a fresh coat of paint and a higher rent price. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. It was erasing itself, like nothing had happened, like I had never been there. I thought about warning the next person, about leaving a review, posting something online. But I didn't. I never went back to that apartment. I never even set foot on that street again. For weeks after leaving, I fought the urge to check the listing, to see if someone else had moved in, to find out if anyone had reported something strange. But every time I got close to searching for it, a feeling crawled up my spine, like I was doing something wrong, like I was inviting it back. So I stopped. I forced myself to move on, to push those memories to the back of my mind. I told myself it was over. But the thing is, some doors don't stay closed. I moved to a new apartment across the city, a place with big windows and no history. I made sure of that. At first, everything felt normal. I settled into my routine, went to work, saw friends. I tried to act like I hadn't spent months living in a place that wanted me gone. But the fear didn't disappear. Even now, there are nights when I wake up too suddenly, my heart hammering for no reason. Sometimes, in those first few seconds of waking, I forget where I am. And for that brief, terrifying moment, I think I'm back there, back in that dark apartment, back with it. I have to remind myself where I am, tell myself that I'm safe. But that feeling never really goes away. There are so many things I still don't understand. What was behind the wall before I found it? Who put it there? And the biggest question of all, where did it go? I try not to think about it, but sometimes the thoughts creep in anyway. What if someone else found that hidden room? What if someone else is hearing the scratching right now? What if it followed me? I don't tell this story to scare people. I tell it because I need someone to know. Because places like that exist. Because things like that exist. And if you ever move into an apartment and something feels off, if the walls seem too thick, if you hear sounds at night, if you get the overwhelming urge to leave, listen to it. Because some places, they don't want you there. And some things, they don't want to stay hidden. It was the summer of 2009 when I moved into that house. I was 26 at the time, ready to start fresh in a new city. I had just accepted a new job, a decent position in an office that, at the time, seemed like the perfect opportunity. The house was a rental, a modest two-story place on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't anything special, just an old structure with peeling white paint, creaky wooden floors, and a small, overgrown backyard. It had been sitting empty for a while before I moved in, and I could tell. Dust clung to the baseboards, and the air smelled stale, like it had been sealed up for too long. But it was cheap, and I was eager to have a place of my own. The owner had barely given me a tour before handing over the keys. He seemed eager to leave, barely making eye contact when he said, "You'll get used to it." I remember how his voice sounded, like he wanted to say more, but thought better of it. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time at work, coming home late and exhausted. My routine was simple. Wake up, grab coffee from the shop down the street, drive to work, come home, watch some TV, and sleep. I had always been a night owl, and I liked the quiet of the house after dark. The neighborhood itself was eerily silent at night, barely any movement except for the occasional car passing in the distance. It wasn't until the end of my first month there that I started noticing something else, something harder to explain. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling a presence behind me when I was alone. There was a specific spot in the house, at the bottom of the staircase, where the feeling was the strongest. Whenever I passed it, my skin would prickle, like unseen eyes were tracking my every move. At night, it was worse. I started sleeping with my bedroom door shut, something I had never done before. There was no logical reason for it. I just felt safer that way. I'd tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was adjusting to a new space. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. The turning point came late one night after I had fallen asleep with the TV still on. I woke up abruptly, the room completely silent except for the faint hum of the screen. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. Then I noticed it, the feeling that someone was in the room with me. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't see a shadow, but I knew. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, straining my ears for any sound. There was nothing. Just silence. Too much silence. I forced myself to sit up, scanning the room, my eyes darting to the closed bedroom door. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. The feeling didn't go away. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I pulled the blanket over my head like a child, willing myself back to sleep. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel uneasy in my own home. And this was only the beginning. The night after I first woke up feeling watched, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just nerves, maybe stress from work, maybe adjusting to a new environment. People always talk about that, how moving to a new place can mess with your sleep, make you hear things that aren't really there. That's all it had to be. But something changed after that night. I had been in the house for about a month when I first heard it. It started as a faint murmur, barely more than a whisper, slipping through the walls late at night. At first, I dismissed it as the wind. The house was old, and old houses made noise. But this wasn't the wind. It was different, low, rhythmic, and constant, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. It wasn't loud, just persistent. Some nights, it was so faint I could convince myself it was my imagination. Other nights, it was clearer, more defined, like a voice was pressing against the wall, muffled by the plaster. I couldn't make out the words, only the cadence. It always happened late at night, always when I was alone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the pipes. Maybe the house had thin walls, and I was hearing a neighbor through them. But that explanation never quite fit. My closest neighbor was an elderly man who lived alone, and his house was a good 20 feet from mine. Even if he was talking to himself, there was no way I'd hear him through 2 sets of walls. I tested it. One night, when the murmuring started, I turned off everything, TV, phone, even the ceiling fan, just to be sure. The sound remained. I pressed my ear against the wall, my breath shallow. For a moment, it almost sounded like my own name, stretched and distorted. My stomach twisted, and I pulled away fast. I didn't sleep much that night. The voices were one thing, but the chair was another. One morning, I walked into the kitchen, rubbing my eyes, still groggy from another restless night. And that's when I saw it. One of the wooden chairs from the dining table was in the middle of the kitchen floor. At first, I didn't react. I just stood there, blinking at it. Maybe I had moved it and forgotten. That made sense, right? People do things half asleep all the time. But something about it felt wrong. I tried to recall the night before. I had eaten dinner at the table, like always. I had pushed the chair back in place, like always. I was sure of it. And yet, there it was, sitting several feet away from where it should have been, angled slightly, like someone had pulled it out and left it there. I put it back and went about my day, but the thought stayed with me. I started paying closer attention to how I left things. making mental notes of where I placed objects before going to bed. Then it happened again. 2 nights later, I walked into the kitchen and the chair was in the same spot, sitting in the middle of the floor. This time, my chest tightened. I had made sure the night before to push all the chairs in, even double checking before going to bed. Yet, here it was again. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, my pulse heavy in my ears. I wasn't sleepwalking. I wasn't forgetting. Something was moving that chair. I tried to play it off. Maybe it was uneven flooring. Maybe I had bumped it and not realized. But no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, the feeling remained. Something was wrong with this house. After the chair, I started noticing other things. Small things. The way certain rooms always felt colder than others, no matter how high I set the thermostat. The way the air seemed heavier in some places, pressing against me like invisible hands. The worst spot was at the base of the stairs. It was the only place in the house where the temperature seemed to drop sharply. I could feel it every time I passed through, a pocket of freezing air that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just cold, it felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every time I walked past, a shiver ran through me. And every time, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. It got to the point where I started avoiding the stairs after dark, choosing to stay downstairs until I was too exhausted to keep my eyes open. One night, I forced myself to stand there. Just stand at the bottom of the stairs and face it. If it was just my imagination, then nothing would happen. I stood there for nearly a full minute, staring into the darkness above. And then, a creak, soft, deliberate, coming from the top step. I didn't wait. I turned on every light in the house and stayed awake until morning. The night I saw the door move was the night I stopped pretending things were normal. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to keep my mind occupied. I had left the bedroom door open just a crack, not wide enough for anything to move through, just barely ajar. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it shift. A slow, deliberate motion, like someone was on the other side, pushing it open inch by inch. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The room was dead silent. Then, the door stopped. For a full minute, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, just as slowly as it had opened, it closed again. I didn't sleep at all that night. After that, everything felt different. The air in the house seemed heavier, the shadows darker, the nights longer. Every sound made my heart race. Every creak sent adrenaline flooding through my veins. I started leaving the lights on, keeping the TV running in the background just to break the silence. I still hadn't told anyone. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was happening wasn't in my head. Something was in that house with me, and it was just getting started. The night after the bedroom door moved on its own, I barely slept. Every sound, every shift in the air felt like a threat. My body stayed tense under the covers, my ears straining for anything out of place. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, staring at the dim glow of the screen, counting the hours until sunrise. But whatever was in that house had no intention of letting me rest. It started subtly, a distant creak, the kind an old house makes when it settles. But then it happened again, and again. I sat up in bed, my breath held tight in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, soft, deliberate steps moving through the hallway outside my bedroom. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. That's what stress does, right? It makes you see things, hear things. But then, the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, my fingers gripping the blanket so tightly my knuckles ached. And then, tap, tap, tap. A slow, rhythmic tapping against the door. I felt ice slip down my spine. I forced myself to swallow, my throat dry. My brain screamed at me to do something, to get up, to grab my phone, to turn on the light. But I couldn't. The tapping came again. I wanted to call out, demand to know who was there, but the words died before they reached my lips. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. I stayed awake until morning, staring at the door, waiting for it to move again. It never did. The chair in the kitchen had been unsettling, but it was only the beginning. Now, things were moving constantly. I would place my keys on the table, only to find them in the living room. My phone charger disappeared from my nightstand, only to turn up in the hallway. Drawers I knew I had closed would be slightly open. The worst was my wallet. One morning, I was running late for work. I reached for my wallet, knowing I had left it on the counter the night before. But it wasn't there. I searched everywhere, under the couch, in the bathroom, even in the fridge. Nothing. I was on the verge of giving up when I spotted it. It was sitting at the top of the staircase, perfectly centered. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I hadn't gone upstairs at all the previous night. There was no reason, no logical reason. It should be up there. I approached cautiously, my pulse pounding. As I bent down to pick it up, a cold chill wrapped around me, sinking into my skin like ice water. I grabbed the wallet and bolted out of the house. That was the first time I left without locking the door behind me. By this point, I had started avoiding the house as much as possible. I stayed out late, spent extra hours at work, even sat in my car scrolling through my phone just to delay going inside. But no matter how much I tried to escape it, the house wouldn't let me. One night, I had no choice but to come home late. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally stepped inside, exhausted, my nerves frayed. I went straight to my bedroom, barely glancing at the dark hallway as I passed. I was too tired to be scared. I just needed sleep. I had just pulled the blankets over me when I heard it. A whisper, soft, close, right next to my ear. And it said my name. My body locked up. The room was silent, too silent. I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my chest. I turned on my phone's flashlight and scanned the room, my breath coming in short gasps. There was nothing there, but I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I had reached my breaking point. I needed to know what was happening in that house. The next morning, I did something I should have done the moment I moved in. I started researching. I searched for old records, news articles, anything that could give me a clue. And that's when I found it. Buried deep in an online forum about local history, I found a post from years ago, someone asking about my address. The responses sent a cold shiver down my spine. One person claimed a man had lived there decades ago, alone, reclusive, rarely seen by neighbors. Then, one day, he simply vanished. No one knew what happened to him. His house sat abandoned for years before it was put back on the market. And now, I was living in it. That night, I barely touched my dinner. My mind was a storm of thoughts, memories, every single thing that had happened over the past few months. I sat on the couch, staring at the staircase. The cold spot was there, like always, an invisible weight pressing against the air. And then, a shadow moved, at the top of the stairs. I didn't even have time to process it. 1 second, the staircase was empty. The next, something was there. Tall, dark, motionless. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I felt it watching me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick, suffocating. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs. And then it stepped forward. The floorboards groaned beneath it, slow and deliberate. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up. Another step, then another. I forced myself to move, bolted from the couch, grabbed my keys, and tore out of the house so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the ignition. The moment the engine roared to life, I looked up. The window on the second floor. Something was standing there, watching me. I slammed the gas pedal and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I checked into a motel that night. I didn't care about the cost. I just needed to be anywhere but there. I barely slept, my mind racing. What had I seen? Was it real? Or was I finally losing it? I thought about calling someone, anyone, to talk about it. But what would I even say? That my house was haunted? That I saw something standing in my hallway? They'd think I was insane. But I knew the truth. I had seen it. And now I had no idea what to do. One thing was clear though. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I sat in my car outside the motel, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to go back to that house. I couldn't go back. But I didn't have a choice. My work laptop was still there. So were my clothes, my documents, everything I owned. I couldn't just leave it all behind. I had no plan, no idea what I would do when I got there. But I told myself it'd be quick. It'd go in, grab my things, and get out. Simple. At least, that's what I thought. The drive back felt like moving towards something I knew I wouldn't come back from. My stomach twisted with every mile. My pulse pounded with a deep, relentless force. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house stood silent. Still. Too still. Even in broad daylight, something about it looked wrong. The air inside was ice cold the second I stepped in. My breath hitched, my skin tightening against the sudden chill. I forced myself to move, to not think about the last time I was here. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and started stuffing clothes inside. I worked fast, yanking open drawers, piling up whatever I could find. The faster I moved, the sooner I could leave. But then, a sound. Soft, barely audible. My bedroom door creaked open. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The door was wide open. I knew I had closed it. I told myself the house was old, that maybe it had drifted open on its own. But my body knew better. Something was in there, watching me, waiting. I grabbed my bag and stepped toward the door. The air inside the room was even colder, heavy with something I couldn't see but felt deep in my bones. And then, my closet door slammed shut. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. My mouth went dry. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. And this time, whatever it was, it wanted me to know it was there. A low, dragging sound came from behind the closet door, like something shifting, something moving. I should have run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out. But my feet were frozen in place. I stood there, every muscle locked in terror. And then the door slowly started to open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness. And then I saw it. Not a person, not even a shape, but something that shouldn't exist. The darkness inside the closet wasn't empty. It was thick, too deep, like looking into a space that didn't belong to this world. And in that darkness, I saw movement, a shifting, writhing mass of shadow. And then, two eyes. Not human, not anything I could understand. They weren't glowing. They weren't red or white or anything like you'd see in a movie. They were just there, staring right at me. And then in a voice so low it felt like it came from inside my own head. It spoke, just one word. "Stay!" I snapped. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't care what I left behind. I didn't care about my laptop, my furniture, my clothes. Nothing mattered. I ran down the stairs, yanking open the front door so hard it nearly came off the hinges. And just as I crossed the threshold, a cold hand grabbed my arm. I didn't stop. I wrenched free, tumbling onto the porch. I scrambled to my feet and ran straight to my car. The second I was inside, I locked the doors and hit the gas. My tires screeched against the pavement as I tore out of the driveway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew if I did, I'd see it standing there, watching me leave. And worse, it wouldn't be alone. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going. My hands shook so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. It wasn't until I was in the next town over that I finally pulled over. I sat there, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. And then, my phone buzzed. A single notification from an unknown number. I hesitated before looking, and when I did, my stomach dropped. There was no message, no text, just a photo. A picture of my bedroom, taken from inside the closet. I sat in my car on the side of the road, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. My hands trembled as I held my phone, staring at the screen, at the picture that shouldn't exist. My bedroom, the bed unmade, the closet door slightly ajar. The angle was all wrong. It had been taken from inside. Something or someone had been there, had been watching me. Had it always been watching? The thought made my stomach churn. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat like it was contaminated. My skin crawled. My mouth felt dry, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to do something. But what? I couldn't go back. That was out of the question. I needed help. But how do you explain something like this to someone without sounding insane? I spent the next hour in a haze, driving aimlessly through town, my mind replaying every event over and over. Every sound, every shadow, every whispered word. I stopped at a gas station, needing to clear my head. The fluorescent lights inside were too bright, the buzz of the overhead fixtures drilling into my skull. I grabbed a coffee, though I had no appetite for it, and sat in my car. My fingers hovered over my phone. Who could I even call? The police? And tell them what? That a house was watching me? That I had seen something unnatural inside my closet? I could already hear how that conversation would go. Even if they did check, what would they find? A house, an empty bedroom. Maybe my things still scattered from when I had run. They'd pat me on the shoulder, tell me I was stressed, or worse, laugh at me. No, the police weren't an option. I thought about calling a friend, someone who might take me seriously. But what if I dragged them into this? What if it followed? I couldn't risk it. I was on my own. I checked into a different motel that night. Some rundown place off the highway. The kind of place where no one asks questions. I triple-locked the door and shoved the armchair against it for good measure. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The eyes in the closet. The picture on my phone. I tried to convince myself it was some elaborate prank, but that didn't explain the things I had seen. The things I had felt. I kept the lights on, sitting up in bed with my back against the headboard, staring at the door as if expecting it to open on its own. The room was silent except for my breathing. Then, the phone buzzed again. I swallowed hard. My fingers hovered over the screen. Another message. No text. Just a video. The thumbnail alone made my stomach lurch. It was of my front door. From the inside. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed not to press play. But I did. The screen flickered as the video loaded. At first, it was just my front hallway. Empty. Still. Then, movement. A shadow passing just beyond the frame. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. And then, the video cut to black. That was it. I stared at my reflection in the darkened screen, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. Someone or something was still inside that house. And now, it wanted me to know. I made up my mind that night. I had to get out of town. I didn't care what I left behind. My jobs, my furniture, my entire life in that house, it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't safe. I could never go back. By sunrise, I was on the road, driving with no clear direction, only one goal, to get as far away as possible. I didn't stop except for gas. I ignored my phone, ignored the buzzing notifications that I refused to check. I just kept driving. It wasn't until I was 2 states over that I finally pulled into another motel, exhausted and running on nothing but adrenaline. I collapsed onto the bed, my body aching, my mind too drained to function. For the first time in days, I let sleep take me. And for the first time in days, I didn't dream. It's been months now. I never went back. I never could. I left behind everything, my belongings, my job, even my bank accounts. It was easier to start fresh, to erase any trace of the life I had before. The house still stands. I checked once, late at night when I couldn't sleep. It's still listed under my name, still sitting empty. No one has moved in. No one wants to. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's still waiting for me. If it is still waiting. I don't check my phone much anymore. I don't want to know if there are more messages, more pictures, more videos waiting for me in the unread inbox. I don't want to see what it might have sent, because if I do, I might finally have to admit the truth. That leaving wasn't enough. That whatever was in that house might still be watching. It's strange how quickly life can change. One moment, you think you're living a normal life, routine, predictable, safe. Then, in an instant, everything shifts. I used to believe that fear was something you could overcome, that logic could explain anything if you looked hard enough. But I know better now. There are things in this world that don't want to be understood. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I've moved 3 times since I left that house. Each time, I make sure no one can track me. No digital footprints. No forwarding addresses. I don't stay anywhere too long. I don't let people get too close. Not because I don't want to, but because I can't. The feeling never leaves me. That sense of being watched. It follows me, no matter where I go. At night, I still wake up gasping, heart pounding, convinced that something is in the room with me. But when I turn on the lights, nothing. There's always nothing. But I know better than to trust what I see. I keep my phone off most of the time. It sits at the bottom of a drawer in whatever temporary home I've settled into, untouched. I should have thrown it away. I should have destroyed it. But I didn't. And one night, months after I thought I had finally escaped, I made the mistake of turning it back on. Just to check. Just to see. The battery was nearly dead. Notifications piling up from apps I no longer used. Messages from numbers I didn't recognize. But one notification stood out. A single text. From that same unknown number. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers frozen above the screen. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't. But I did. Just 3 words. I found you. There was nothing particularly strange about the apartment when I first stepped inside. It smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of scent you'd expect from a place that had been untouched for years. The air was thick and unmoving, but that was nothing unusual. It'd been in abandoned buildings before, old houses, forgotten warehouses, places people once lived and then left behind. They all had a stillness to them, like a paused moment in time. But this apartment wasn't like the others. Not at first. Not in the way I could explain. It was a last-minute arrangement. I had just moved to the city, hoping to settle into a new job and start fresh. The problem was, finding a decent place to stay was almost impossible on short notice. Hotels were too expensive, and most rentals were either occupied or required months of waiting. That's when I heard about this apartment. It belonged to a distant acquaintance, someone I barely knew, but they knew someone who knew me, and that was enough. They had inherited the place after a relative passed away, but had no interest in living there. Instead of letting it rot, they offered it to me for a week while I searched for something permanent. "Just don't mess with anything," they said over the phone. "The place is old, but it's still in decent shape. Electricity works, water runs, but just don't mess with anything." That last part stuck with me. Not in a way that felt ominous, just strange. I didn't ask questions. I needed a place to stay, and for a week, I wasn't about to be picky. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 5-story building that hadn't seen much maintenance in years. The lobby smelled like damp concrete. The elevator creaked when it moved, and the hallways were dimly lit with flickering bulbs that cast strange shadows on the walls. When I unlocked the door, the first thing I noticed was how normal it looked. The living room had a couch covered with a white sheet, a coffee table with a layer of dust, and a few shelves with old books stacked unevenly. A small kitchen sat to the right, with an old fridge and a gas stove that looked like they hadn't been used in ages. The bedroom had a full-sized bed, a wooden dresser, and a closet that smelled like aged fabric. A single window overlooked the street below, where the dim glow of streetlights flickered against the cracked pavement. For an abandoned place, it wasn't bad. A little musty, sure, but nothing a few open windows couldn't fix. I dropped my bags in the bedroom, grabbed my phone, and checked for service. A single bar flickered on the screen before disappearing completely. No Wi-Fi either. That was a problem, but I told myself it was temporary. The first night was uneventful. I made a quick dinner with the groceries it brought, scrolled through some offline notes on my phone, and went to bed early. The silence in the apartment was heavier than I expected. No hum of a fridge, no ticking clock, nothing but my own breathing. I don't know why, but I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, feeling like something was different. Not wrong, just different. Like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. By the second day, I had settled into a routine. I woke up early, went out for job interviews, grabbed lunch at whatever place was nearby, and came back to the apartment before sunset. The building felt even emptier than before. No sounds from the neighbors, no footsteps in the hallway, nothing. I told myself it was just an old, forgotten place. That was the logical explanation. That evening, I sat on the couch with my laptop, jotting down potential apartments to check out the next morning. The room was quiet, the only sound coming from the occasional car passing outside. Then I heard it. A soft creak. It came from the hallway outside the apartment. Not loud, not aggressive, just enough to make me look up. I waited, listening. Nothing followed. I shrugged it off. Old buildings made noises. Wood expanded, pipes settled, the wind pressed against the windows. It wasn't unusual. But for the first time since I moved in, I locked the door. By the 3rd day, things started feeling off. It was nothing obvious, just little things. The way the air felt heavier when I stepped inside after being out all day. The way the shadows stretched oddly in the corners of the room. The way the silence wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. That evening, as I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I heard something shift in the bedroom. A small movement, like fabric brushing against the floor. I turned off the faucet and listened. Nothing. I walked over to the bedroom doorway, peering inside. The bed was untouched. My bags were where I left them. Everything was normal. But the closet door, it was open. Just an inch. I didn't remember leaving it open. A chill crawled up my spine, but I forced myself to ignore it. Maybe I had left it like that and just didn't notice before. I shut the door, locked it, and told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That night, I barely slept. The fourth night in the apartment was when things started to shift. I had spent the day outside, walking through different neighborhoods, checking out rental listings, and trying to find something that felt like a better long-term option. The city was busy, but the moment I stepped into the building, it was like entering a different world, silent, heavy, and strangely still. I made my way up to the third floor, my footsteps echoing against the worn-out tile floor. When I reached my door, I paused. Something was different. At first, I couldn't tell what. The door looked the same, the handle in its usual place, the lock unbroken. But the air, it felt like someone had just been there. Like the last trace of movement had just settled. I shook the feeling off and unlocked the door. The second I stepped inside, I stopped. The closet door in the bedroom was open again. Not an inch this time, almost halfway. My stomach twisted. I knew for a fact I had closed it the night before. More than that, I had locked it. I stood there for a moment, my breath shallow, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The apartment was dead silent. The only thing I could hear was the faint buzz of the city outside. I walked in slowly, every step hesitant. My shoes tapped softly against the old wooden floor as I made my way toward the closet. The door was open wide enough to reveal the darkness inside. I couldn't see anything but the faint outline of the clothes hanging there, unmoving. My fingers tightened around the handle as I pulled it shut again. The lock clicked into place. I took a slow breath, exhaling through my nose. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly before. Maybe the old hinges made it slide open on its own. That explanation made sense. But if that was true, why did the room feel colder now? That night, I double-checked everything before going to bed. Closet? Locked. Front door? Locked. Windows? Shut tight. I turned off the lights and got into bed, pulling the blanket over me, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise seemed louder, the occasional creak of the wood, the faint hum of the pipes, the distant murmur of the city outside. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, and then I heard it. A rustling sound, soft, faint, coming from inside the closet. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding against my ribs. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe my brain was making something out of nothing. And then, tap! A single, light sound, like fingertips against wood, inside the closet. I sat up so fast my vision blurred. My chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking out along my back. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the closet door. It was still shut, locked. The sound didn't come again. I swallowed, my throat dry, my fingers gripping my phone so tight they ached. I should check. I didn't want to, but I should. I forced myself to get up, legs unsteady as I walked toward the door. My fingers hovered over the lock. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed, "Don't open it." But I had to. I turned the lock and pulled the door open. The light from my phone cut through the darkness inside. Clothes, an old suitcase, dust collecting in the corners. Nothing else. I let out a shaky breath, half laughing at myself. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the old wooden frame was just settling. But as I turned to walk away, my flashlight flickered. Just for a second. And in that brief moment, I saw something. Low to the ground. In the back of the closet. Something pale. Something curled up in the darkness. And then the light came back. And it was gone. I slammed the closet shut so hard the walls shook. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. I backed away, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed, my mind racing. I had seen something. I knew I had. But that didn't make sense. The closet was empty. It had always been empty. Hadn't it? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light in the apartment turned on, my back against the couch, my phone clutched tightly in my hands. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, stressed, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the next morning, when I finally worked up the nerve to open the closet again, the suitcase had moved, and there was a single dirty handprint smeared on the inside of the door. After seeing the handprint inside the closet, my stomach twisted into knots. The rational part of my brain struggled to come up with an explanation, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I stood there staring at the smudged print, my fingers gripping the edge of the door so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The mark wasn't mine. It was too small, too faint. I reached out hesitantly, my fingertips hovering just above the stain. The air near the door felt colder, like a draft seeping out from the closet itself. I pulled my hand back and shut the door. For the rest of the morning, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the moment I had opened the closet the night before, the flicker of my flashlight, the shape I had seen, the way it had disappeared the second the light returned. Had I really seen something? Or was my exhaustion starting to mess with my head? I grabbed a rag from the kitchen and scrubbed at the handprint until it was gone. Then I forced myself to leave the apartment. I needed to clear my head. The day felt normal, but the moment I stepped back into the apartment that evening, the feeling returned. That sense of being watched. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like something unseen was pressing down on my chest. I locked the door behind me and let my bag drop onto the counter, trying to shake off the unease. I walked through the apartment slowly, checking everything again. Closet? Locked. Windows? Shut. Nothing out of place. I took a deep breath, forcing my shoulders to relax. Maybe I had let my imagination get the best of me. I turned on the TV for background noise and went about making dinner. As I chopped vegetables at the counter, I started to feel a little more at ease. That is, until I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak. I froze, knife hovering above the cutting board. It came from the bedroom, the closet door. I turned my head toward the hallway, my breath shallow. The TV continued playing behind me, its low hum the only sound in the apartment. I waited. Silence. Forcing myself to move, I wiped my hands on a towel and stepped cautiously toward the bedroom. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached the doorway. The closet door was still shut. I exhaled, running a hand over my face. I'm losing it. But then I saw the rug. It had shifted, only by an inch, but enough that I noticed. Enough to make my chest tighten. I had never moved it. Not since I arrived. I hesitated, then crouched down, lifting the edge of the rug with shaky fingers. The wood underneath was scratched. Long, uneven scratches, like something had been dragged across it. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just the apartment settling. Something had moved in here. That night, I barely slept. Every noise sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of the old pipes. At some point, exhaustion took over and I dozed off. But I woke up immediately. A sound. Soft. Slow. Breathing. Close. I lay perfectly still, my body stiff with terror. The sound was coming from the closet. I turned my head slightly, my pulse hammering. The closet door was still shut. But the breathing, it was deep, rhythmic, like someone was on the other side of the door. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, trying to move as quietly as possible. My fingers fumbled for the flashlight, but the second I pressed the button, the breathing stopped. The room fell into an awful, ringing silence. I held my breath, my body rigid. Seconds passed. Then, the closet door handle turned. My heart stopped. The metal handle clicked, shifting downward, like someone was trying to open it. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as slowly as it had started, the handle released. A small, mechanical click as it returned to its original position. I scrambled backward, nearly falling out of bed, my flashlight beam shaking wildly across the room. The closet was still shut, but I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. The next morning, I made a decision. I was done ignoring this. Something was wrong with this apartment. I spent hours searching for information. I looked up the building's history, the previous tenants, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No crimes, no reports, no records of anything unusual. It didn't make sense. I called the landlord, trying to be subtle. I asked about the apartment's history, if anyone had moved out suddenly before me. He hesitated. Then, in a clipped tone, he said, "People don't stay long in that unit." I pressed him for more, but he refused to say anything else and hung up. That was enough for me. I decided I would leave the next day. But the apartment wasn't done with me yet. That night, I barricaded the closet door. I pushed the dresser in front of it, stacked heavy books against the bottom, and tried to convince myself that I would get through one more night. I fell asleep sometime after 3 a.m., and I woke up cold. The air had changed. It wasn't just cold, it was frigid. My breath came out in visible puffs. Something was wrong. I reached for my phone, but the second my fingers brushed against it, the closet door rattled. Not just a little. Hard, violent, pounding. The dresser shook against the force, the books tumbling to the floor. I scrambled up, backing into the corner of the room. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but I was frozen. The pounding stopped. Silence! And then, a sound that made my skin crawl. A voice! From inside the closet. A low, whispering voice. Let me out. I bolted. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my bag and ran for the door, throwing it open so fast that it slammed against the wall. I didn't look back. Not even when I heard the closet creak open behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I barely noticed. My heart was hammering so fast I thought it might burst. I kept moving, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands trembling so hard I could barely keep a grip on my phone. I needed to get away. I didn't care that I was barefoot. I didn't care that my bag was half open, my belongings spilling onto the pavement behind me. I just had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that apartment. I finally stopped when I reached the dimly lit street corner a few blocks away. My legs ached. My chest burned. I fumbled with my phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but my fingers were too unsteady. My breath hitched as I turned back toward the building. The apartment window was completely dark. No movement. No sign of anything. Had it really happened? No, I knew what I heard. That voice. Let me out. The way it had rasped, so close, yet muffled behind the wood. It was real. Something was in there. I needed answers. After pacing for what felt like hours, I forced myself to go back. Not inside. Never inside again. But I needed to know. I circled around the building, my steps careful and slow. The place was eerily silent, the street lamps flickering in and out. My breath formed small clouds in the cold air. I found the landlord's number in my call history and dialed again. Straight to voicemail. I gritted my teeth and tried again. This time, he picked up. "What do you want?" His voice was tight, annoyed. I swallowed hard. "There's something in that apartment." Silence. Then, a sigh. "I told you people don't stay long." I felt anger rise in my chest. Why? What the hell is in there? He hesitated. I could hear his breathing on the other end. Then, finally, "It's been empty for years." I gripped the phone tighter. "No, it hasn't. Someone was in there. No one has lived there since 2005. My stomach dropped. That wasn't possible. I had seen furniture when I moved in a bed. A dresser. A couch. I don't. My voice cracked. I don't understand. But then, something changed. The phone crackled. The line filled with static. And then, a voice. But not the landlord's. A whisper. Right through the phone. "You came back." My blood ran cold. The call disconnected. I stood there, my entire body trembling. The air around me shifted. That same heavy, suffocating presence. The same pressure, as if something unseen had just taken a step closer. I wasn't alone. Even out here. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached a motel on the other side of town. I paid in cash, barely able to speak to the night clerk, my fingers still shaking. Once I locked the door behind me, I collapsed onto the bed, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was racing. None of it made sense. If no one had lived there since 2005, who was inside the apartment? And more importantly, who had been talking to me? I barely slept. Every noise outside sent my nerves into overdrive. I kept picturing that closet door, the way it rattled, the voice behind it. Morning came slow. The moment the sun was up, I started making calls. I dug through old records, archives, anything I could find. And finally, I found it. An old newspaper article from 2005. My apartment's address. A missing persons case. A man in his late 20s had been renting that unit. According to the report, he was last seen entering the apartment one evening and was never seen again. No sign of a break-in. No evidence of him leaving. Just gone. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises from inside his apartment in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Knocking, scraping sounds, whispering. One even claimed they saw someone else inside the unit, a shadow moving past the window. But the police never found anything. The apartment was sealed off after that. Abandoned. Until, apparently, I moved in. I stared at the article, my hands cold. I could barely process what I was reading. Had he been trapped in there? Had he never left? I felt sick. And then, a notification popped up on my phone. New voicemail. My stomach twisted as I clicked play. At first, it was just static. But then, a whisper. Low. Faint. "I told you not to come back." I dropped the phone. The room suddenly felt wrong. The air thickened, the way it had in the apartment. Like something unseen was watching. I grabbed my bag, threw open the motel door, and ran to my car. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was far, far away. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away. The motel, the apartment, the entire city I needed distance. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the car. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something. A dark figure sitting in the back seat, a shifting shadow on the road behind me. But there was nothing, just empty asphalt rolling beneath my tires. I told myself I was safe now. But was I? I pulled into a gas station just past the state line, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The place was deserted except for an old man behind the counter who barely looked up as I walked in. I needed a break, some air, something normal. I grabbed a bottle of water and headed to the bathroom. The fluorescent lights inside flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows along the cracked tile floor. My reflection in the mirror looked worse than I expected. Pale, sunken eyes, a face that barely looked like my own. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water over my face. When I looked up, the stall door behind me was open. It hadn't been before. I turned around slowly, my pulse hammering. Nothing. Just a dark, empty stall. I exhaled, forcing myself to breathe. I was tired, sleep-deprived. It'd been running on adrenaline for too long. But just as I turned back to the sink, the stall door creaked shut, on its own. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. I grabbed my things and got out of there as fast as I could. Back in the car, I locked the doors, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. This wasn't over. Even after leaving the apartment, something was still with me. I didn't know where to go. I couldn't go back to my old place, not after what I'd read about that apartment, not after what I'd heard. So I kept driving. Eventually, I found a cheap motel off the highway, nothing special, just a place to crash for the night. I locked the door, bolted it, pulled the curtains shut. I sat on the bed, staring at my phone. That voicemail. I hadn't deleted it. I wasn't sure why. Maybe some part of me needed proof, needed confirmation that what happened was real. But I couldn't bring myself to play it again. I set my phone down on the nightstand, leaned back against the pillows, and closed my eyes. For the first time in days, exhaustion finally took over, and I slept. When I woke up, it was still dark. Something felt off. The air in the room was thick, heavy, like someone else was there. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The shadows in the corner of the room looked different, darker. And then, a noise! Soft, subtle, breathing, right next to me. I turned my head slowly. The motel room had a mirror on the opposite wall, and in the dim light, I saw it. A shape, sitting on the bed, right beside me. I could see the outline of its body. Thin, wrong. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The air grew colder, pressing down on my chest like invisible hands. And then, it spoke, a whisper, so close to my ear I could feel it. You shouldn't have left. My blood turned to ice. I shot out of bed, scrambling for the light switch. My fingers fumbled against the wall, found it, flicked it on. The room flooded with yellow light, and the bed was empty. Nothing, but the imprint of a body was still on the sheets. I grabbed my keys and ran. I left everything behind. My bag, my phone. I didn't care. I had to get out. I jumped into my car and floored it, tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't stop until the motel was just a distant blur in my rearview mirror. I kept moving. For the next few weeks, I bounced from one place to another. I never stayed anywhere longer than a couple of nights. But no matter how far I went, it followed me, everywhere. It'd catch glimpses of something in mirrors, hear faint whispers when I was alone, feel that suffocating pressure in the air, that same presence lurking just out of sight. I wasn't running from a haunted apartment anymore. I was running from something else. Something that didn't care where I went. It was with me now. I don't know how long I can keep running. Some nights, I convince myself that maybe I've put enough distance between me and it, that whatever was in that apartment has finally let me go. But then, something happens. A whisper in an empty room. A shape in the mirror that doesn't belong. A weight on my chest in the middle of the night, holding me down, making it impossible to breathe. It's not constant. There are days, even weeks, when nothing happens. And just when I start to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'm free, it reminds me. Like last night, I was staying at a motel just off the interstate. Nothing special. A room with a stiff mattress, a TV that barely worked, a lamp in the corner that flickered whenever I turned it on. It was just past 3 in the morning when I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The room was silent, too silent. Then I noticed it. The closet door. It was open. Not all the way. Just a crack. But I knew I had shut it before going to bed. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I had just forgotten. But as I lay there, staring at that narrow sliver of darkness, a single thought crept into my mind. What if it's not the apartment that's haunted? What if it was never about the place at all? What if it was always about me? That's the thought that keeps me awake now. I don't stay in one place for long. I don't let my guard down. Because every time I do, it comes back. And deep down, I know. I moved into my apartment on a dull Tuesday morning. The kind of day where the sky is blanketed in gray, neither dark nor light, just still. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was mine. A one-bedroom unit on the top floor of a 3-story building, old enough to have charm, but not quite ancient. The kind of place with creaky wooden floors, drafty windows, and cabinets that smelled faintly of old newspapers. It was the best I could afford, and honestly, I liked it. I had just gotten out of a long-term lease with an unbearable landlord. The kind of guy who'd show up unannounced and inspect the apartment like I was some kind of criminal. So, when I found this place, managed by a quiet older woman who barely asked questions, I jumped on it. Cheap rent, a decent view of the street below, and no nosy neighbors. What more could I want? The first week was uneventful. I unpacked my things, got used to the weird plumbing noises, and settled into a routine. Wake up at 7, make coffee, work a few hours from my desk in the corner, then head out for a walk in the evening. The area wasn't bad, just quiet. The kind of quiet that should feel peaceful, but at times felt empty, like there should be more life, more noise. I didn't have many visitors. My closest friend lived 2 states away, and my job was remote, so there wasn't much reason to leave beyond grocery runs and my evening walks. I liked it that way. Less drama, less expectation, just me and my thoughts. The apartment itself was small but had character. The living room was narrow, with a single couch and a coffee table that wobbled if you leaned on it the wrong way. The kitchen had outdated appliances, but they worked well enough. The bedroom was my favorite part. Big windows that let in just the right amount of morning sun, a decently sized closet, and walls thick enough that I never heard my neighbors. The only thing that felt off, just slightly, was the layout. Something about it didn't add up. When I first toured the place, I noticed the walls didn't quite align in a way that made sense. The bedroom shared a wall with the bathroom, but the space between them felt too wide. Like there should have been another door, another something. But it wasn't my problem. The place was cheap, and I wasn't about to start knocking on walls like some kind of conspiracy theorist. I brushed it off and focused on making the place feel like home. I hung up a few framed photos, stocked the cabinets with my usual snacks, and settled into my usual routine. Everything was fine. Normal. Until it wasn't. The first sign that something was off happened about 10 days in. Small things. Barely noticeable. I'd set my keys down on the counter, only to find them on the floor an hour later. I'd hear faint creaks in the middle of the night, the kind that didn't quite match the rhythm of an old building settling. A feeling, subtle, nagging, like I wasn't alone. But it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It had to be. Nothing was wrong with the apartment. Nothing was there. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The first time I noticed something was truly wrong, it was late, just past midnight. I had been at my desk for hours, finishing up some reports for work. My eyes were dry, my back ached, and my only company was the soft hum of my laptop fan. I stretched, rubbing my face, and pushed my chair back. The apartment was dead silent, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the only person left in the world. I grabbed my phone and stood up, heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the small hallway leading to the bathroom and bedroom, I felt it, just for a second. A draft. Not the kind that comes from an open window. This was different. Cold, but wrong. A still kind of cold. I stopped, standing in the hallway, and listened. Nothing. No wind outside, no distant sounds of the city, just my own breath and the faint ticking of the old wall clock in the kitchen. I shook my head. Maybe I left the bathroom window open. I turned into the bathroom, flipped the light on, and checked. The window was closed, locked. No gaps, no reason for a draft. Still, I pushed on the edges of the frame, making sure. It didn't budge. Maybe the insulation in the walls was bad. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I turned to leave when I heard it. A tap! Light. Quick. Almost too soft to notice. It came from behind me. My stomach twisted. I turned back, scanning the small bathroom. There was nothing. Just the sink, the mirror, the old shower curtain hanging limply in the dim yellow light. I held my breath. Silence! Maybe it came from the pipes. Maybe another tap. This time, I felt it, not just heard it. The air in the bathroom shifted slightly, like a presence had moved. My hands clenched into fists. I wasn't a superstitious person. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that nonsense. But something about this felt different. I took a slow step forward, eyes locked on the mirror above the sink. It reflected the small, dim space behind me, the door, the hallway beyond. My own tired face stared back, dark circles under my eyes. I looked like hell. I reached out and ran my hand along the edge of the mirror. Nothing. No cracks, no loose fittings. The sound hadn't come from here. I exhaled sharply and stepped back. I'm too tired for this, I muttered to myself. I flipped the light off and walked out. I needed sleep. That was all. As I stepped into the hallway, I hesitated. The air still felt off, heavy, like the space around me was holding its breath. I shook it off and walked into my bedroom, shutting the door behind me. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Sleep deprivation did weird things to the brain. That had to be it. I went about my day as usual: coffee, work, a short walk outside to clear my head. The air was crisp, the sun low in the sky. It was one of those quiet autumn mornings where the world felt oddly still, like it was waiting for something. I shook the thought off. By the time I got back, the strange feeling from last night was gone. The apartment felt normal again. Warm. Lived in. I almost laughed at myself for how freaked out I had been. But then, later that night, something else happened. I was brushing my teeth, standing in the same bathroom where I had heard the sound the night before. I wasn't even thinking about it. I was tired, zoning out, staring at my reflection in the mirror. And then, click, the bathroom door swung inward. Not a slow creak, not a shift from an air current. It moved. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway was empty. Just darkness stretching toward my bedroom. I turned back to the mirror. My own reflection stared back, but my focus wasn't on my face anymore. It was on the door behind me. It had been latched. I was sure of it. I swallowed hard, trying to think logically. Maybe I hadn't shut it properly. Maybe the apartment had weird air pressure issues. But as I stood there, toothbrush still in my mouth, I noticed something worse. That feeling, the same one from the night before. The cold, unnatural stillness. And I wasn't in the hallway this time. I was inside the bathroom. I turned, stepped toward the door, and pushed it shut. This time, I made sure it latched. Solid, secure. I backed away, watching it. Nothing happened. I exhaled, shaking my head. I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I finished brushing my teeth, flicked off the light, and stepped into the hallway. The cold hit me immediately. My breath caught in my throat. My skin prickled. The air had shifted again, like something unseen had just stepped back. I stood there, barely breathing, straining to hear any sound. The apartment was silent. I forced myself to move. One step, then another. I walked straight to my bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. And I wasn't alone. At first, I thought I had imagined it. My room was silent, but I could feel something. Something was watching me. I sat up slowly, blinking in the dark. My heart pounded against my ribs. The air was thick, heavy. That same unnatural coldness settled over me. I turned my head toward the bedroom door, and that's when I saw it. The doorknob was turning, not shaking, not rattling, just turning, slowly, deliberately. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stared. Then, as quietly as it had started, the knob stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I stayed frozen in bed for what felt like hours, my eyes locked on the door. Eventually, the air in the room shifted again. The cold eased, like whatever had been there had finally stepped away. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, I checked the front door. Still locked. Windows? Secure. There was no way someone had been in my apartment. But I knew what I had seen. Something was here, and it wasn't going away. That night changed everything. I went through the next day in a haze, barely functioning. My mind kept circling back to what I had seen, the slow, deliberate turn of the doorknob, The way the air felt thick and wrong, like something unseen had been standing there, just waiting. I tried to rationalize it, but the explanation never quite fit. Maybe the knob was loose. Maybe there was some draft I hadn't accounted for. But deep down, I knew something was in my apartment. And whatever it wasn't done with me. More than just a feeling. That evening, I forced myself to follow my routine. Cooked dinner, watched some mindless TV, scrolled through my phone, anything to make the place feel normal again. But the unease never really left. It was in the way my skin prickled when I walked past certain areas of the apartment, in the way I found myself hesitating before opening doors. And then, around midnight, it happened again. I was in the kitchen washing my plate when I heard it, soft at first, almost imperceptible. A shuffling sound, like someone shifting their weight. I froze, listening. It was coming from the hallway. I turned off the faucet slowly, water dripping down my hands as I strained to hear. Silence! For a long moment, I just stood there, heart pounding. Then, just as I began to convince myself I was imagining it, something else happened. A creak! A single drawn-out creak of wood, as if someone had just taken a careful step. The hallway floor. I turned my head slowly, breath caught in my throat. The hallway was dark, the bedroom door still slightly ajar from earlier. I wiped my hands on my shirt, trying to ignore the way my fingers were trembling. My rational brain told me to turn on all the lights, to check every inch of the apartment. But another part of me, the part that was already starting to understand that something unnatural was happening here, wanted to lock myself in my room and pretend none of this was real. But I couldn't do that anymore. So, I stepped forward. The apartment felt impossibly quiet. Even the hum of the fridge seemed distant, as if the air itself had thickened. I reached the hallway and stood there, staring into the darkness of my room. Then I noticed something. The air was colder again. That same unnatural stillness, like the space around me was holding its breath. I reached for the bedroom light switch and flicked it on. The moment the room illuminated, I felt it, an overwhelming sense that something had just moved out of sight. Not physically, but there. Like I had just interrupted something. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. Everything looked the same. Bed unmade, laptop still on my desk, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the small space. And then I saw it. The closet door. It was open. Not wide, just a crack. Just enough. I hadn't opened it. I knew for a fact it had been shut when I left for work. The feeling in my gut twisted into something sharper, colder. I took another step forward, my breath coming faster now. The light from the bedroom barely reached the inside of the closet, leaving the back shrouded in darkness. I stood there, staring into it, waiting, listening, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. I reached out, grabbed the edge of the door, and pulled it shut. Firm. No gaps. I stepped back, exhaling shakily. Then I locked it. That night, I barely slept. A hidden space. By the next morning, I had made a decision. I needed to check the apartment properly. I spent hours going over everything. Windows, doors, floorboards, vents. I even checked under my bed like a damn kid afraid of the boogeyman. But there was nothing. Then I got to the closet. I hesitated before opening it again, but I had to. Inside, everything was exactly how I had left it. Old coats, storage boxes, a few pairs of shoes. But something about the back wall caught my attention. The paneling looked off. I ran my hand over it, pressing lightly. Solid. But when I knocked, it sounded different, hollow. My stomach twisted. I grabbed the edge of one of the panels and pulled. It shifted. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. there was space behind it. A hidden space. My hands felt clammy as I pried the panel further. It resisted at first, then suddenly gave way with a soft pop. Behind it, there was a narrow, pitch-black gap. I stared, my breath shallow. The space was small, barely enough for a person to stand in. But there was something there. A shape! Something huddled in the corner. For one terrifying second, I thought it was a person. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized, no, not a person. Objects, boxes, and a chair. A single wooden chair facing the closet opening. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring into that dark, hidden space. Everything about it was wrong. The smell, stale, like dust and something else, something old. The air, cold and thick, as if it hadn't been touched in years. And the feeling, that awful, suffocating feeling that something was watching me. I forced myself to reach inside, my fingers brushing against one of the boxes. It was covered in dust, old and heavy. I pulled it out and placed it on the floor. Inside, there were photographs. Black and white, faded at the edges. Some of them were of my apartment, or at least the building before it was renovated. And then I saw the ones that made my skin crawl. Faces, dozens of them. Men, women, even children, all staring at the camera with hollow, lifeless eyes. And then, at the very bottom of the box, I found something else. A notebook. Its pages were filled with cramped, erratic handwriting. Dates, names, strange, unsettling phrases. Still here, watching, one leave, waiting. The last entry sent a cold shiver through my entire body. He doesn't know yet. I slammed the notebook shut. My head was spinning. My stomach churned. This wasn't just an old storage space. Someone had used this. Someone had sat in that chair, writing those words. And they had been watching. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I shoved the box back inside, forced the panel shut, and left the room, locking the door behind me. But as I stood in the hallway, breathing hard, I realized something. The cold feeling hadn't gone away. In fact, it felt stronger. Like whatever had been hidden in that space knew I had found it. And now, it was waiting. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photographs, those faces staring back at me, empty and lifeless. I saw the notebook, the frantic handwriting, the words that felt more like warnings than simple notes. Still here, watching, won't leave. And worst of all, he doesn't know yet. But I knew now, and that was the problem. I had made up my mind to call my landlord first thing in the morning. There was no way I was staying in that apartment any longer than I had to. But deep down, I already knew something had shifted. When I woke up, if I could even call it that, I felt it immediately. The air was different, thicker. The unnatural stillness I had felt before was stronger now, wrapping around me like an invisible weight. I sat up slowly, my skin prickling with that awful sensation of being watched. Then I saw it. The closet door, wide open. My stomach dropped. I had locked it. But now it stood open, revealing the dark space beyond, the hidden gap where I had found the chair, the photos, the notebook. The air felt colder near the doorway, as if something had been standing there, just waiting. I forced myself to move, my pulse hammering in my ears. My body felt sluggish, like I was pushing through thick water. As I stood, a noise filled the room, a low, creaking sound. The chair. I could see it now, just barely, through the narrow gap. It had moved. It was no longer facing the closet wall. It was turned toward me. A sharp, suffocating wave of panic surged through my chest. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My breathing was shallow, fast, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my skull. Then I heard something else. A whisper, soft, breathy, coming from inside the closet. I ran. I bolted out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind me, my hand shaking so badly I could barely twist the lock. I backed away, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The apartment was too quiet, too still. I reached for my phone, my fingers slipping against the screen. I didn't even know who I was calling. 911? My landlord? A friend? But before I could dial, something happened that made my blood run cold. The doorknob turned, slowly, deliberately, just like before. I froze, my entire body locked in place as I watched it twist, the metal glinting under the dim light. Then, click, the door started to open. I staggered back, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed impossibly black, stretching into something deeper, something wrong. I forced myself to move, darting toward the front door, my fingers fumbling with the lock. Then I heard it. A footstep, soft, slow, coming from inside my room. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. My breaths came in short, panicked gasps. I didn't stop moving. I couldn't. I took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly losing my footing in my rush to get out. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the freezing night air, my chest heaving. I turned, staring up at my apartment window. And then, the light in my bedroom turned on. I didn't do that. And worse, there was a shape standing in front of the window. Not fully formed, not quite solid, but there, watching me, waiting. I didn't go back inside that night. I stayed in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing through every possible explanation, every excuse that could make this something normal. But there was nothing. By morning, I had made my decision. I needed answers. I drove straight to my landlord's office, demanding to know everything about that apartment. At first, he was dismissive, told me he didn't know what I was talking about. But I kept pushing. Then his expression changed. He looked uncomfortable. I don't know what you're expecting to hear, he finally said, shifting in his chair. But that place has always been weird. I leaned forward. What do you mean? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, I don't know the full story, but I do know that apartment sat empty for a long time before you moved in. Every tenant before you left within a few months complained about strange noises, weird feelings, things moving on their own. I swallowed hard. And the closet? His face paled slightly. That was boarded up years ago, he said. No one was supposed to open it. I stared at him. My pulse hammered in my ears. Why? His eyes flickered toward the window, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in and lowered his voice. The man who lived there before? He paused. He disappeared. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean disappeared? Gone, the landlord said. Vanished. No sign of him. They searched the apartment, found his stuff still there. His clothes, his phone, even his wallet. But him? He shook his head, like he never existed. I gripped the arms of the chair. What does that have to do with the closet? The landlord hesitated. Before he went missing, he told the neighbors something weird. Said he kept waking up in the middle of the night and finding the closet door open. He was sure he had locked it. Kept hearing whispers, footsteps when he was alone. I felt my stomach turn. But the worst part? The landlord's voice was barely a whisper now. The night before he disappeared, he told someone that he found something inside. I could barely breathe. What did he find? The landlord's eyes met mine, and what he said next made my blood run ice cold. He wouldn't say, just kept repeating one thing over and over. I waited, my entire body tense. Then he spoke. It knows I found it. I left that office feeling like I had stepped into a nightmare. I had to get my things. I had to leave. But when I got back to the apartment, something had changed. The door was unlocked, and sitting in the center of my living room floor was the notebook, open to the last page. A new entry, written in my own handwriting. I shouldn't have opened it. The apartment was silent, but I knew, deep in my bones, that I wasn't alone. And I never had been. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. That notebook. I knew I hadn't written that last entry. I shouldn't have opened it. The handwriting was mine. The ink looked fresh, but my hands had never touched that page. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the apartment, pressing against my chest. The air inside felt thicker, colder, wrong. I could feel it. Something was waiting, watching. I had come back to pack up my things, to leave this place behind for good. But now, standing there with the open notebook in front of me, I realized something terrible. It wasn't going to let me go so easily. I could feel my body tensing with every instinct screaming at me to run. But at the same time, something inside me felt trapped. If I left, would it follow? Or worse, would it just wait for the next person? I didn't want to know the answer. I took slow, cautious steps toward the notebook, my heart hammering against my ribs. The pages shifted slightly, as if touched by an invisible breeze. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm leaving," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "You don't want me here, and I don't want to be here." Silence. Then, the bedroom door creaked open. My breath hitched. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. My eyes darted toward the hallway, toward that dark space leading to the room where this nightmare had begun. I clenched my jaw. I wasn't staying to find out what was inside. I grabbed the nearest bag, throwing in whatever I could: clothes, my laptop, my wallet. My hands were shaking so badly that I kept dropping things, my fingers slipping on the fabric. I didn't care. I needed to get out. But then, a sound from the bedroom. A single, deliberate knock against the inside of the closet door. My blood ran cold. No! No, no, no. I wasn't staying. I turned and bolted toward the front door, fumbling with the lock. And then I heard it. A whisper, right behind me. "Leaving want help." I gasped, twisting around, my back pressing against the door. But there was nothing there. Just the empty, dimly lit apartment. No shadows. No figures. But I could feel it. It was close. I forced myself to turn back, to focus on the lock. My hands were shaking too much, but I had to get out. I managed to twist the knob, throwing the door open so hard it hit the wall. Then, just as I was about to step outside, I felt it. A cold breath against the back of my neck. I didn't look back. I ran. Down the hall, past the stairs, straight out of the building. The moment I hit the cold night air, I finally sucked in a breath, my lungs burning. I kept moving, practically sprinting to my car. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my entire body trembling. My chest was tight, my mind racing. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to ground myself, trying to convince myself that I was safe. Then, before I could stop myself, I looked up at my apartment window. The light was still on, and there, standing in the window, was a shape. Not fully formed, not quite solid, but there, watching me, waiting. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the shape lifted its hand and waved. That was it. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires screeching as I peeled out of the parking lot. I didn't stop driving. Not for miles. Not until I was in front of a cheap motel on the other side of the city, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles ached. I sat there, shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had left. I was gone. But something told me I wasn't free. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that cold breath on my skin, heard that whisper in my ear. Leaving won't help. By morning, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just pretend this never happened. I spent hours searching for any records of the apartment, anything about its history. There wasn't much, just a few scattered complaints from previous tenants, strange noises, objects moving on their own. One note from a tenant who had left after only 3 months, claiming they felt like they were never alone. And then, buried in an old forum post from over a decade ago, I found it. An old missing persons report. The last tenant before me. His name wasn't familiar, but his description sent a chill down my spine. He had lived in that same apartment, and one day he had just vanished. His belongings were left behind. His wallet, his keys. The only thing out of place? His closet door had been found open. I felt sick. I shut the laptop, staring blankly at the motel room wall. I had left. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I never went back to that apartment. Even after I had moved my things out, even after I had returned the keys, I refused to go near that building. I didn't even drive down that street. The very thought of it made my skin crawl, like something was still waiting, still watching. But the worst part, I never really escaped it. For weeks after I left, I kept feeling like I wasn't alone. It didn't matter where I was, the motel, my car, even the new place I rented across town. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my breath hitching, convinced that something was standing at the foot of my bed. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. Objects moved on their own. Small things at first, keys not being where I had left them, doors creaking open just slightly. Then it got worse. One night, I came home to find the closet door in my new bedroom wide open. I hadn't touched it. I stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness beyond that doorframe, waiting for something to move, for something to show itself. But nothing did. I shut it and shoved a chair against the handle. I barely slept that night. A month passed, and I started convincing myself that maybe it was just paranoia. That maybe whatever had been in that apartment had stayed there. Then, one night, I got a text. Unknown number. No name. Just 2 words. Still here. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, that it had to be a joke. But who would even know? I hadn't told anyone the details of what happened, hadn't mentioned the closet, the figure in the window, the whisper behind me. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. I told myself it was a coincidence. But that night, I woke up gasping for air, my chest tight with fear. I could feel it. A presence. Something standing just beyond the edge of my vision. I forced myself to turn on the light. The room was empty. The door was still locked. But my closet, the chair I had placed against the door, had been moved, and the door was open again. Just an inch. Enough for something to peek through. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I moved out of that place 2 weeks later. Left everything behind. I packed what I could fit in my car and drove across the state without looking back. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just left. It's been a year now, and I haven't felt anything since. No cold breath against my skin. No whispers. No shadowy figures standing in windows. But sometimes, just sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, feeling like I'm not alone.